two, one. Great. Good afternoon. I'm Tom Butcher of the Zero Project, and I'm here in Vienna talking to my pal, Professor Michael Stein, who is the executive director of the Harvard Law School project on disability, not surprisingly, in Harvard. He and I are going to talk about inclusive resilience, integrating disability into crisis response and climate action. I've got three questions that I'm going to ask Michael, and then as he and I discussed, if we have time, we'll riff. So, Michael, great to see you. I'm only sorry you're not here. However, this is second best. First question I have for you is, why are persons with disabilities at greater risk in climate disasters?
Well, thank you, Tom, for the kind words, and thank you to my Zero friends for enabling me to Zoom in next year in person. Persons with disabilities are certainly at greater risk in climate disasters. The evidence tells us that, for example, in 15 years of wildfires in Australia, 90% of the fatalities were people with one or more disabilities. We know that severe heat has an impact upon individuals with psychosocial disabilities at a rate of 2 to 4 times that of others. And to give another example, on the other side of the globe, persons with albinism don't have access to adequate suntan lotion or health care. We know that during natural disasters, all people are at risk, of course, but people with disabilities also have additional issues, such as being abandoned, losing their caretakers who enable them, their medications, and their technology. And the reason that people with disabilities are at greater risk or rendered more vulnerable, in quotation marks, is not because of their inherent disabilities or impairments, but because policymakers and others have created an environment that is not accessible to them. So emergency alerts, by and large, are not accessible. Shelters may not be accessible. Transportation may not be accessible. And so people with disabilities cannot leave or mitigate these effects at the same level that others can. We've put them into a bad place, and it shows.
Thank you. I think that puts it very, very clearly and starkly. My second question is, that being the case, how can we advance disability-inclusive crisis responses?
Well, that's an excellent question, and that goes to the heart of the matter, Tom, as you would do. From the top down, there's an issue of exclusion. One of the main themes of the Harvard Law School project on disability from the days of being part of the negotiations on the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is ensuring that disability is front and center and included rather than being invisibilized. Here in climate change, which is a global and existential issue, we have a population worldwide of 1.3 billion people with disabilities, 16% of the population. And yet people with disabilities are by and large invisible or silenced. Were it any other sector, public health or poverty or any other sector, if we were missing 16% of the population that's supposed to be included, red flags would go up. But so far they have not with disability. So we look at the Paris agreements, which is, a very useful device, even if governments, including and especially the United States, don't finance it at an adequate level. And we see that something like 80% of the nationally determined contributions don't even have the word disability in it. And those that do, the 20 or so percent, group disability amongst other vulnerable, again, quote unquote, vulnerable populations. As the economists say, if you're not counted, you don't count. If we don't let operations managers, if we don't let those who are implementing understand and have guidance on how to include people with disabilities, they'll simply be left at the margins. We also see in other processes, such as at the COP, which just occurred, that there's not a disability constituency. There are constituencies for many other groups. There are over 2,000 petrol company members who are entitled to enter into negotiations, go wherever they like. But people with disabilities were not at the table. In fact, they were barely in the room. This year, there was something like 16 representatives of the global disability rights community, and they were in a room by themselves speaking to each other. That's not innovative and that's not inclusive. But we do know that there are some good practices. So the IMF has pulled out some very good practices in Bangladesh and in Bhutan. The World Bank, as part of its environmental work, has tried to target and highlight disability. There are good practices that are slowly developing. I wish it was much quicker.
Great. Which brings me on, that's great, because it brings me on to my final question, which you've touched on a wee bit, which is how can innovative disability inclusive climate responses actually be developed? And then I'd like to add on to that as the first bit of our riff, and that is where and by whom. So the first is how can they be developed?
So that's a wonderful question. The first is to, of course, conceive that and admit that people with disabilities exist and ought to be part of the design of policies, the implementation of policies. If we actually look at the academic research and the literature on climate responses, we see that disability is marginalized. It barely appears. We were very proud and happy to lead the effort in Lancet Planetary Health, but that's merely sand against the ocean. The other is, again, including people with disabilities in the co-design of policies. We often say within the disability rights community that people with disabilities are problem solvers. We also say just generally that people know their needs better than anyone else. Looking to people with disabilities and trying to understand how they would design a policy, what their needs and priorities are, and putting that into a policy is the most effective way. So a very simple example, when we put in e-bikes and bike lanes in cities, we ought to make sure that people with disabilities can still access the accessible transportation that's often on the other side and sometimes barriered from their accessing it. Another way is to think about how people with disabilities should and can be involved. In all the world, there is one total handbook on disability and climate change responses. There are dozens relating to indigenous groups, and that's wonderful, relating to other groups, and that's equally wonderful. I'm proud to say my wife developed this handbook from HPOT. It's being distributed by UNICEF. It's on the World Bank's website. I hope everyone goes and utilizes it. But the fact that only now in 2024 was the first handbook on what people with disabilities themselves need to know shows us that there isn't this dissemination of information and connection and community. Also, next year when we reconvene in person at the Zero conference, we will have the results of the call that Zero is going to be putting out over the next few weeks. And that's going to be a really unique one. It will include some things that we know about, such as disability inclusive disaster risk reduction, DIDRR, but also it will ask for communities of people with disabilities to share their local knowledge, to share what their responses, what their adaptation and mitigation approaches are to climate change, both natural disasters and slow onset of climate change. There is no place in the world where you can look and find that information. There's no place where DPOs and NGOs and environmental NGOs can go and find that information and include it in their programming and learn from each other. So I'm really excited and really proud that we'll be working to gather that information and to disseminate it at next year's Zero.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that as well. I've got a few other questions, and the first one is, this whole issue is, if you kind of use that American expression, a double whammy, isn't it? And the second whammy is that there's crises and crises. There are long-term crises, i.e. crises which take a long time to play out, and there are crises which are immediate: inundations, flooding, earthquakes. how does one deal with the fact that so many of these situations are essentially rather like climate change long term, and we have to keep up the impetus, and that's a kind of added layer of difficulty in the problem solving?
You're entirely correct, Tom, to point out that we're operating on two levels. One is in the immediate response to crises, and the other is in thinking more long term on how to have adaptation measures. And by the way, the funding is entirely focused on the ecumenical, the universal mitigation of the climate crisis. And that's great, even if we have not put in anywhere near the amount of money, innovation, and thinking that needs to go. But part of the answer is that when we respond to these immediate crises, we need to do so in an inclusive manner rather than an ad hoc exclusive manner, which merely mitigates and just increases the equity gap between disability populations and others. It's the equivalent of universal design. If we respond to disasters in a universal way, then we'll include people with disabilities, we'll capture them amongst all the groups that are being responded to. We won't need to retrofit, we won't need to go back afterwards and reinvent the wheel. And it's that second part, which is always the most expensive and the most difficult to do, whether it's policies in response to disasters or mere architecture. But another thing to mention is that, we need to innovate and be clever. Our greatest resource as human beings is our intelligence and our desire to innovate and be creative. So a solution that's been out there for a long time was developed by Ecuador, a low-income country, way ahead of very others. And there they use GPS technology to identify the location of their populations of people with disabilities so that in the event of either a radical onset or otherwise, they know where the populations are. They know where to reach them. This again is a low-income country, and the example is out at least 12 years. High-income countries don't have this. Yeah. Here in the United States, during Katrina and Rita, the hurricanes, we didn't know where the populations of people with disabilities were. We didn't have the design. And so being there afterwards, the psychiatric hospitals in Mississippi, people were still locked up. But without their medication, people in New Orleans drowned and died in these psychiatric hospitals. And yet, 15 years later with Hurricane Sandy, New York City, where I'm from and proud of, didn't have accessible emergency alerts. How could that be? Well, fortunately, some of my wonderful former students sued the city of New York and tried to change that. And we saw in the most recent set of hurricanes going up the East Coast that we had better responses. So we need to learn from what we know, we need to apply it, and we need to understand that innovation comes not only from people with disabilities, but also from local communities who know best how to respond to these matters.
Excellent. Michael, thank you so much. We have 1 minute, 33 seconds. So, as I talked with you about, what 2 or 3 kind of calls to action or points would you like our audience to take away with them before you and I part ways today?
Thank you, Tom. From the top down, we need to have policies that are inclusive of, co-designed with, and implemented by and with people with disabilities. On the scientific research area, we need not only research, but also the NGOs who work on climate change to include people with disabilities so that we have greater knowledge base and better ability in order to respond. And we need to have innovation led by local DPOs, organizations of persons with disabilities who can access their own priorities, needs, and creative ideas.
Great. Michael, thank you very much indeed. It's always a pleasure to chat with you. I'm only sorry that you're not here with me. Next year you will be. And may I thank you on my behalf, and I think of everybody else's behalf, whether in front of me now or watching the telly, for your time today and major insights. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.